A bizarre murder occurred in the bustling centre of London. Lord Edgware was found dead in his study. According to eyewitnesses, only the Lady Jane Wilkinson had entered the study that evening. However, the lady had a solid alibi, proving she was at a dinner party at the time, with over a dozen people able to vouch for her presence, leading the investigation into a deadlock. Why did Lord Edgware die, and what unspeakable secrets are hidden behind these contradictory clues? Hello, everyone. Today, I bring you a story based on Agatha Christie's novel, 13 at Dinner. Lady Jane Wilkinson, a stage actress, invited her family and friends to watch her debut that evening. However, when she had intimate contact with a male actor, Lord Edgware inappropriately applauded. In his eyes, this act was a humiliation. In fact, the relationship between the couple had been in name only for some time, and seizing the opportunity, Jane proposed divorce. However, an infuriated Edgware refused her, unable to accept the notion of divorce given his public stature. The protagonist, Poirot, is a famously renowned detective in England. Early in the morning, his good friend, Captain Hastings, flew in to visit him. Though it was a visit, it was actually because Captain Hastings had suffered investment losses and was specifically coming to London to find a place to stay. That evening, an actress invited Poirot to watch a performance. To lift Captain Hastings' spirits, Poirot took him along. The actress was particularly skilled at impersonations, even managing to imitate Poirot perfectly. After the show ended, Poirot and Captain Hastings, still delighted by the performance, prepared to leave when Jane suddenly caught up to them. Poirot's reputation was well known, and Jane sought his help in persuading her husband to agree to a divorce. Despite the abrupt request, Jane was desperate, as her current life was sheer torment. Poirot, being kind-hearted, thought that if there truly was no love left between them, letting go might indeed be the better option. The next day, Poirot visited as Jane's representative to discuss the matter of divorce. Lord Edgware appeared very impatient upon hearing the purpose of the visit. Although he had indeed refused the divorce during their last meeting, he had since changed his mind after some reflection and had even sent a formal letter notifying Jane of his decision. This puzzled Poirot. Had Jane received the letter, she certainly wouldn't have sought his help. He then inquired about the address to which Lord Edgware had sent the letter. The Lord mentioned that Jane had been living at the theatre, and that was the only address he knew. Upon returning, Poirot relayed this information to Jane. As Poirot had suspected, Jane had never received any letter from the Lord Edgware. The theatre's mailbox was communal, and it was possible that someone else had taken the letter by mistake. However, this no longer seemed important to Jane. The thought of her imminent freedom filled her with joy. She had initially declined an invitation to a dinner party that evening, but upon hearing this news, she decided to attend and celebrate. At the dinner party, including Jane, there were a total of 13 guests. Among them was a playwright working on a script about the Trojan War, expecting his name to become world-renowned upon its completion. While people were chatting, Jane received a phone call. After a brief conversation, she returned to the banquet hall. At the same time, a woman dressed in black arrived at the Lord Edgware's home. The butler, who opened the door, identified the visitor as Jane, despite her having worn a bright red outfit at the party. She had now changed into black attire. Learning that the Lord was working in his study, Jane went straight there. The next morning, the police were notified that the Lord had been murdered in his study, stabbed in the neck from behind in an apparent surprise attack. Poirot was thoughtful. During his last visit, the Lord had withdrawn a large sum of money in francs from the bank to purchase a painting in Paris, but the police did not find this money after searching the entire room. Later, Inspector Japp brought in the butler, who reported that the Lord had been killed around 10 p.m. the previous night. The police wanted to know who had visited during that time. The butler truthfully answered that the lady had returned at 9:30 p.m., saying she knew the way to the study, so he didn't pay much attention to it until discovering the Lord's body at 8 a.m. the next morning. Poirot asked the butler if he had seen Jane before this incident. The butler said he had only been employed for a month and that by that time, the Lord and his wife were already separated. Yesterday was the first time he had seen her. From this, it could be inferred that the person might not have been Jane but someone impersonating her. However, the secretary was very certain, having seen Jane enter the study from the second-floor corridor the previous night. Although her face was obscured by a hat, the secretary claimed she could recognize Jane even if she turned to ashes. In addition to the secretary and the butler, the Lord's daughter, Geraldine Marsh, also lived at home. Surprisingly, Geraldine harbored no affection for her father and even believed he deserved his fate. Geraldine was forthright and saw no need to lie. However, the police still wanted to verify her whereabouts the previous night. Geraldine claimed she was at the theatre all evening and didn't return home until the early hours, with her cousin, Captain Ronald Marsh, able to vouch for her. The police then questioned Jane, the prime suspect, about her whereabouts the previous night. Jane explained that she was supposed to be at home but changed her plans to attend a friend's dinner party after hearing the good news brought by Poirot, with over a dozen people available to corroborate her alibi. To prove her innocence, Jane detailed her entire itinerary for the evening. At 7 p.m., she left her house for the Royal Palace Hotel, where she had a meeting with an American woman. After chatting for about 20 minutes, Jane took a taxi to the dinner party, where she stayed until midnight before returning home. The detective further inquired if she had left the party at any point. Jane mentioned that around 9:30 p.m., a woman called her, only to ask if she was the Lady Jane and then abruptly hung up after a few minutes. Jane insisted it would have been impossible for her to commit the murder in such a short time frame. Without concrete evidence, Poirot and Japp visited the other guests at the dinner party to inquire if Jane had been present throughout the event. Everyone confirmed that Jane had not left, appearing very joyful, especially since her divorce from her husband would allow her to marry the Duke of Merton, a true nobleman with extensive properties across London. On the other side, Geraldine approached Ronald. Although they appeared to be siblings, they were actually lovers. Recently, they had cleared all their debts with a sum of money, a fact that would normally be cause for celebration. However, Ronald's expression turned grave upon hearing of Poirot's involvement in the investigation. Where had the money to pay off their debts come from? And what connection did they have to the Lord's death? The next day, an actor named Brian Martin approached Poirot. Jane's debut performance had been with him, and he came to Poirot with a request. A female friend of his was being stalked by an ugly individual with gold teeth, and Brian wanted Poirot to investigate. Before leaving, Brian casually mentioned something. During his conversation with Jane, she had expressed a desire to kill her husband. Brian knew her well. Despite her seemingly harmless appearance, for Jane, killing could be as simple as drinking tea. Poirot was puzzled why Brian would mention this at such a crucial moment, especially since Brian was unaware that the Lord had already been murdered. Realizing the implications of his words too late, Brian could only hastily depart. Recently, Poirot had met a large number of actors, and it was also a female actress who had invited him to the performance. As he spoke, Poirot suddenly paused, realizing he had overlooked such a crucial person. He quickly took Captain Hastings to the actress's home, but they arrived too late. She was already dead, lying on her bed, having stopped breathing. A preliminary examination suggested that the actress died from an overdose of sleeping pills, potentially an accident. However, Poirot had a different opinion. He believed that the actress had disguised herself as Jane to kill the Lord and was then silenced by the true mastermind behind the scenes. The murderer had planned from the start to frame Jane for the crime. During their search, people found a wig, a pair of leather shoes with height-increasing insoles, and other makeup items in the actress's room. Clearly, she had been disguising herself as someone else. In addition, Poirot found a pair of pince-nez glasses and a relative's box containing sleeping pills in her makeup bag. The box was engraved with the words, November 10th, P to CA. Since November was 7 months ago, it appeared that the actress had been taking sleeping pills for some time. Poirot asked the maid about the time the actress left home yesterday. The maid mentioned that around 7 p.m. last night, the actress left wearing black clothes and a new hat she had bought last week at a friend's clothing store. Poirot's thoughts became clearer. Jane had changed her plans to attend the dinner party at the last minute. If she hadn't gone, she wouldn't have an alibi, and the murderer's plan to frame her would have succeeded. This led to the question: who harbored such great animosity towards Jane? Poirot approached Jane to inquire about Brian, who seemed to have some prejudice against her. Although unsure why Poirot brought him up, Jane candidly shared that after her relationship with her husband deteriorated, she had a brief romance with Brian. They broke up before she met the Duke of Merton. On the other hand, Brian approached his current girlfriend. Jane initially had the most suspicion against her, but he had seen her walking with Poirot. If Poirot fell for her charms, her suspicion might significantly be cleared. However, his girlfriend venomously stated that it was too early to tell and vowed to make him pay. Up to this point, there was more than one suspect. The Lord's daughter harbored deep hatred for her father, who had left her mother to marry Jane. Ronald was in dire need of money and had recently cleared all his debts. And the suspicious behavior of Brian and his girlfriend raised questions about who the real perpetrator was. Back at the deceased Lord's house, the Lord's secretary and the butler were discussing the case. Upon hearing that the murderer might be someone else, the butler became very agitated and then hurriedly packed his belongings to flee. The secretary found this behavior odd and reported it to Inspector Japp. Fleeing at this time meant the butler must know something, leading Japp to order a citywide search for the butler's whereabouts. The actress's sister came to the costume shop looking for her, but was met with the tragic news of her sister's murder instead. The shop owner, being a close friend of the actress, sought out Poirot. The sister's arrival could potentially aid the investigation. It turned out that the sister had received a letter from the actress that morning, prompting her visit. She handed the letter to Captain Hastings, which mentioned Ronald wanting to hire the actress for a real-life prank, promising her a payment of $2,000 upon completion. Poirot pondered the situation. Hiring someone to commit murder seemed far-fetched. The so-called real-life prank was essentially having the actress disguise herself as Jane as a diversion, thereby framing Jane for the crime. The real perpetrator was still Ronald, but the question remained. How could Ronald have the time to commit the murder when he and the Lord's daughter, Geraldine, were at the theatre at the time of the Lord's murder? Coincidentally, Inspector Japp made a discovery. The theatre was only a mile away from the Lord's house. After interviewing several taxi drivers in the vicinity, he learned that Ronald and Geraldine had left the theatre during the intermission. The driver took them to the Lord's house and then back to the theatre. This provided Ronald with the opportunity to commit the crime. Faced with police questioning, Ronald did not deny that he had indeed visited the Lord's house, but not with the intent to commit murder. Due to his overwhelming debts, he sought help from the Lord's daughter, Geraldine, who happened to have a collection of pearls. Selling them would not only clear his debts but also support their living for some time. Their secretive return was actually to retrieve these pearls. Inspector Japp continued to inquire if Ronald had seen anything that night. Ronald suddenly remembered seeing Brian rushing out of the villa in a panic before they entered. At the time, he hadn't thought much of it, but now he considered Brian a significant suspect. If Ronald wasn't the murderer, then why would he offer to pay the actress $2,000? Hearing this figure, Ronald appeared bewildered. Burdened with debts, he couldn't afford such a high payment. If the actress claimed this, she must have been lying. The suspicion of murder kept shifting from one person to another, making it impossible to pinpoint the real culprit without key evidence. At that moment, a subordinate reported that the butler had purchased a plane ticket to Buenos Aires, apparently attempting to flee. Inspector Japp immediately led a team to the airport. Fortunately, the plane had not yet taken off. During the chase, the butler accidentally fell from the rooftop and died, with banknotes from his wallet scattering everywhere. It turned out the missing francs from the lord were stolen by the butler, who, realizing Jane's suspicion had been cleared, knew the police would eventually trace the theft back to him, leading him to plan his escape with the money, only to meet a tragic end. Back home, Poirot was deep in thought. To find the murderer, he needed to clarify 5 questions. 1. The lord had agreed to the divorce and sent the letter to the theatre. Who took that letter? 2. Jane received a phone call at the dinner party, but she had decided to attend last minute. How did the caller know her location? 3. Poirot found a pair of pince-nez glasses in the actress's bag. Neither she nor Jane wore glasses, and even for a disguise, such an accessory seemed unnecessary. What were the glasses for? 4. The letter the actress wrote to her sister mentioned Ronald's account never had $2,000. Why was this written? Was it to conceal the true identity of the employer? 5. The medicine box was inscribed with P to CA. CA are the actress's initials, but who is P? Solving these mysteries was crucial for unraveling the case. The next day at noon, Ronald invited Poirot and Captain Hastings to his house for lunch. It turned out the police had released him due to a lack of direct evidence. With so many clues still to unravel, Poirot had no time for social gatherings, so he asked Captain Hastings to attend in his stead and act as his eyes and ears. Meanwhile, Poirot's female assistant relayed a message. She had visited several jewelers and finally found the craftsman who had engraved the medicine box. According to the craftsman, the inscription was added a few weeks ago, not 7 months prior, and the client was an American woman wearing pince-nez glasses. This name was not unfamiliar to Poirot. On the night of the Lord's murder, Jane had met this woman at the hotel for about 20 minutes. Who was this mysterious woman, and what connection did she have to the Lord's murder? Soon after, Captain Hastings returned from the lunch, handing Poirot a business card. A playwright wanted Poirot to call him back. Although the two had never interacted before, the playwright specifically asked for Poirot, suggesting he must have discovered something related to the case. Poirot hurriedly made the call, but as soon as the connection was established, the playwright was attacked by a mysterious assailant. According to Captain Hastings' recollection, the playwright had handed him the business card during lunch. The murderer must have overheard their conversation and followed them to silence the playwright. Poirot asked who was the first to leave the lunch. The captain initially said Brian and his girlfriend left first, followed by Jane and the Duke of Merton. However, after reconsidering, he realized it was actually the opposite. Jane and the Duke left first, with the other two leaving later. Hearing the phrase, just the opposite, made Poirot have a sudden insight, as if all the clues were finally coming together. In the evening, Poirot gathered everyone at the theatre to reveal the true identity of the murderer. Almost everyone had a motive to wish the Lord dead. Ronald needed money, Geraldine sought revenge for her mother. The Duke of Merton also understood that with the Lord's death, he could marry his beloved. However, the person with the greatest suspicion was Brian, who had fallen in love with Jane but was heartlessly rejected by her. This rejection filled Brian with hatred toward her, and framing Jane for the Lord's death would serve as his ultimate revenge. That day, Brian approached Poirot, claiming a female friend was being stalked by a man with gold teeth. However, this was entirely fabricated. He approached Poirot to suggest that Jane, despite appearing harmless, found killing as easy as drinking tea, intending to persuade Poirot of Jane's guilt. This motive implied Brian knew of the Lord's death before meeting with Poirot, suggesting he could be the murderer. However, on the night of the murder, Geraldine and Ronald returned home to fetch pearls and reportedly saw him leaving the house, which seemed like conclusive evidence. Upon hearing this, Brian became agitated. He admitted to making up the story about the stalker and indeed sought to frame Jane, but he insisted he did not kill the Lord and had not visited the Lord's house that night. Poirot smiled, confirming that Brian was not the murderer. His accusation was a form of punishment for Brian's deception. Indeed, what Ronald actually saw was the butler, who had already been aware of the Lord's death on the night it occurred. However, he deliberately delayed reporting the crime until the next day in an attempt to conceal his theft of the money. Upon learning that Jane had a solid alibi, the butler became noticeably flustered. This reaction was due to the realization that the police would begin to look for other motives behind the crime, such as identifying who stole the money. Although the butler was not the murderer, being investigated for the theft would leave him utterly unable to defend himself, truly leaving him with no way to clear his name. Besides them, another person influenced Poirot's judgment, the Lord's secretary. When mentioning the woman who entered the study at 9:30 p.m., the secretary was adamant that it was Jane, even claiming she could recognize her from ashes. Such a statement was tinged with personal animosity. It turned out that the secretary harbored special feelings for the Lord. In her eyes, Jane was not worthy of him. After eliminating these misleading signals, Poirot revisited the 5 questions, starting with the origin of the medicine box inscribed with November 10, P to CA. Despite the craftsman's statement that the box was new, the murderer's intention was to suggest that the actress had been taking sleeping pills for 9 months, framing her death as an accident. However, the truth was that the actress had never used sleeping pills. She was murdered, and the pince-nez glasses found in her bag were left there inadvertently. The murder night saw an American woman named Carlotta Adams booking a room at the hotel, her disguise so thorough that recognition was nearly impossible. Poirot clarified, there was no American woman. This was merely a disguise. He approached Jane, revealing her carefully planned plot to murder her husband was about to be exposed, surprising everyone. Jane had a solid alibi at the dinner party, leading to questions about how she could be the murderer. Poirot explained that Jane visited the Royal Palace Hotel before the party, not as herself but disguised as an American woman. After booking a room, the actress arrived for their meeting. Jane's plan was for the actress to impersonate her at the dinner, allowing Jane to commit the murder while having a perfect alibi. Doubts arose about how no one recognized the actress at the party. Poirot noted that under dim candlelight, with a wig and changed clothes, and the actress's skillful impersonation, it was unlikely for guests, who had only met Jane once or twice, to suspect anything. The phone call the actress received midway was from Jane, confirming the plan's success, after which Jane decisively murdered the Lord. Next, Jane needed to deal with the actress, knowing once the Lord's death became public, suspicion might fall on her. After the dinner, Jane lured the actress back to the room and poisoned her celebratory drink with a large dose of sleeping pills. An hour later, the actress succumbed to the effects at home. Jane exposed herself by 2 fatal mistakes. She accidentally left her pince-nez glasses in the actress's bag while swapping clothes, which Poirot confirmed belonged to his maid, and at lunch, the playwright mentioned the Judgment of Paris, while Jane talked about Paris, raising suspicion due to her previous knowledge. Japp questioned the letter mentioning a man's hiring, which Poirot explained was Jane's masterstroke. The actress did write a letter but forgot to send it, and Jane saw it. The letter mentioned Ronald and the employer, but Jane removed the page linking Ronald to the hiring. Poirot noticed inconsistent indents on the last page, leading to his speculation. The misunderstanding of a male employer arose from seeing the word at the start of the last page, but a crucial part was torn, changing she to he, thus successfully framing someone else. People couldn't understand why Jane would resort to murder when the Lord had already agreed to the divorce. Poirot explained that divorce wouldn't solve her problem. Since the Duke of Merton adhered to Catholicism, Catholics cannot marry someone who is divorced. Thus, the Lord had to die for Jane to marry the Duke of Merton smoothly. Poirot's analysis was impeccable, and Jane, realizing she could no longer escape, admitted to everything. She had manipulated men with her beauty, not realizing that her schemes would ultimately be unveiled by Poirot, who was committed to seeking justice and truth. The story concludes here. 13 at Dinner, also known as Lord Edgware Dies, straightforwardly reveals the victim's identity, but who the murderer is remains a mystery throughout the narrative. Like most of Agatha Christie's works, as the investigation deepens, nearly every character is found to have a motive for the crime. This presents a challenge to Poirot, as well as to the audience, requiring them to think critically. Only by clearing away layers of mystery can the ultimate truth be uncovered. In Agatha Christie's oeuvre, 13 at Dinner, also known as Lord Edgware Dies, may not boast the same level of fame as the illustrious Murder on the Orient Express or Death on the Nile. However, in terms of the ingenuity of the crime and the rigor of the investigative logic, this case is in no way inferior to any of Christie's works. Jane is an exceptionally clever woman who knows how to create a fog of confusion and how to bury false clues beneath the truth. Take the small medicine box, affectionately engraved with P to CA, for example. Who would suspect that this was a red herring by the murderer, designed to mislead everyone? And even if it were investigated, who could trace it back to a non-existent person? Similarly, her disguise as an American woman leads down a path that ultimately yields nothing. This exemplifies the brilliance of Jane's manipulation. Some might wonder why there was a need to involve Poirot in the first place. What if Jane had not asked Poirot to persuade the Lord to divorce? Would the outcome have been different? In fact, involving Poirot was part of Jane's plan. Knowing that Poirot would not ignore a murder case, she preferred to take the initiative rather than be caught off guard. By asking Poirot to intervene, she aimed to make it known that the Lord had agreed to the divorce, ostensibly removing her motive for murder. However, if she had chosen another method to kill the Lord and then produced the letter of consent for divorce afterwards, it wouldn't have been as convincing as having the Lord personally express his agreement. By eliminating the motive for murder and securing an irrefutable alibi, Jane aimed to completely clear herself of any suspicion. Jane underestimated Poirot's meticulous attention to detail, which far exceeded her understanding. The smallest of clues, such as the medicine box, the imprints on a letter, or even an inconspicuous pair of pince-nez glasses, could serve as breakthroughs in his investigations. Anyone daring to commit a crime in front of Poirot does so out of underestimation, only to realize their mistake when it's too late for second chances. Agatha Christie's works often dissect human nature through crime. The butler who hides the truth for money, the secretary blinded by jealousy, Brian willing to frame others for revenge, and Jane, who disregards lives for her own ends. Their mistakes stem from the evil within, highlighting a hopeful desire for humanity's goodness and a world filled with warmth, contrary to the often harsh reality. Poirot is kind-hearted, striving to protect everyone, yet he can't prevent people from harming themselves. As evil grows within, the harm people do to themselves begins, underscoring the complexity of human nature and the moral dilemmas we face. That concludes today's story. If you enjoyed my narration, remember to press and hold the like button. Your support is the greatest encouragement for me.